And today we're diving into maybe the most, let's say, charged topic in American history.
Yeah.
The real causes, the multifaceted causes of the Civil War.
Absolutely. It's incredibly sensitive, and our listener provided a really substantial batch of research, articles, historical analyses, stuff that directly challenges the narrative most of us learned.
That narrative being basically the war was all about slavery.
Yeah.
Full stop. But these sources, they actually call that the Great Lie.
Right. So our mission today, let's be very clear, is not to debate the morality or push any specific political view. We're acting as impartial analysts here.
Just historians looking at the evidence presented.
Exactly. We have to explore the alternative argument laid out in this material, and that argument is that the conflict was really driven by, well, deep economic clashes, wasn't it?
Economic policy, yeah. And bitter constitutional fights over states' rights, plus just profound cultural differences that had grown over decades.
The core thesis being put forward here is that freeing the slaves, well, that was a result of the war, maybe the most important result, the noblest even.
But not the casus belli, not the reason the fighting started. The research we've got argues the root causes were more about, well, money, power, centralization.
And self-determination, ultimately. Who gets to decide?
Precisely. And, when you think about a conflict this huge, claiming over 620,000 lives, trying to boil it down to just one single cause.
It feels simplistic, insufficient, maybe.
Right. One source reminds us, major historical events are almost never that simple. So our job is to contextualize it, look at the motivations of the key players, political, economic, and really assess why these other issues.
Like the tariff, you mean? And the right to secede.
Exactly those. Why did they generate enough heat to actually break the Union apart? That's what this material forces us to examine.
Okay, so we've got a lot to connect today. We'll start with slavery in its global context, and crucially, the North's financial stake in it. Then we move to the constitutional arguments around secession.
Trace that long economic war fought over tariffs. Unpack the cultural divide.
And finally, zero in on the specific political moves, the economic pressures that the sources say deliberately led to the first shots at Fort Sumter.
It's a hefty stack of material. We need to go deep.
Okay, let's get into it. Starting with, as the sources argue, setting the historical stage for slavery itself. So the first thing these sources really hammer home is the need to zoom out, historically speaking. Slavery, they remind us, is ancient. It wasn't an American invention.
Not at all. It predates the U.S. by millennia. You find it in the Bible, right back in Genesis. And originally, it wasn't primarily race-based.
It was based on, what, conquest? Debt.
Exactly. Military conquest, debt bondage. In fact, the word slave itself, the sources point out, comes from Slav, the ethnic group in Eastern Europe who were frequently enslaved.
That historical context is really central to the argument these sources make about moral hypocrisy later on.
It is, and they bring it right up to the modern day. They cite figures, I think, from the International Labor Office, estimating something like 40.3 million people in slavery today, or, well, as of 2017.
40.3 million, that's staggering. Higher in raw numbers than at any point in history.
It's higher than the 1850s, yeah. And this is where the sources make their first really provocative point.
Which is?
That there's no great outcry, as they put it. No massive international intervention about this current slavery, and not the same relentless historical focus.
Implying what? That the focus on the Civil War serves another purpose?
That's the implication, yes.
Yeah.
That it might be tied to a specific financial or political agenda. Maybe about wealth transfer, centralized power, rather than just pure, consistent moral outrage across time. It's a challenging point they raise right off the bat.
Okay, so sticking with the historical context, the sources also detail the origins of specifically racial slavery, the enslavement of Black Africans.
Right. They trace its systematization back to the 9th century, with Arab Muslims establishing the trans-Sahara trade routes. We're talking over 10 million Africans forcibly taken North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula.
And the sources emphasize African involvement too, right?
Yes. They make a point of saying African chieftains were active participants, selling non-believers captives, often after working them almost to death themselves. It was a huge, established intercontinental trade long before Europeans got heavily involved in the Atlantic trade.
Okay, so that sets the global stage. Now let's bring it to America, because this is where the sources really try to dismantle the idea of slavery as just a Southern thing. They focus heavily on the North's role.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially the northern role in the slave trade, the actual buying and shipping of people. It started small. Boston, maybe 1638.
But then it exploded.
Exploded after 1749, according to the material. That's when the British Crown's monopoly ended. And New England elites, they saw a massive opportunity for, quote, enormous profits.
And do they give examples of these profits?
They do. There's a specific account from a Captain Theodore Cannot, a former slaver. He logs selling 220 slaves and his ship in 1827.
Okay.
His net profit from that one trip, $41,438.
Which sounds like a lot for 1827. What's that today?
Well, adjusting for inflation and comparing it to relative economic output, it's easily over $915,000 from one voyage.
Wow. Okay, so that's a serious financial incentive. That's not trivial.
Not at all. And it wasn't just isolated cases. The sources say it was institutional in the North. They quote a British captain reporting in 1836 that Zanzibar, the slave trading hub, was so overrun with northern flesh peddlers that the locals actually thought Great Britain was just a part of Massachusetts.
That paints a picture, New England dominating the global transport of enslaved people.
That's the argument. And by the time of the Revolution, the sources stress slavery itself was common in New England. In 1783, something like a quarter of Connecticut families owned slaves.
A quarter. That's much higher than I think most people realize.
And prominent figures, too. John Hancock, the big signature on the Declaration. Benjamin Franklin's stepbrother, Josiah. The sources document them as major slave traders or dealers. It wasn't just a Southern phenomenon.
So this deep Northern financial connection brings us to the sources' argument about hypocrisy, especially around Northern emancipation laws later on. Pennsylvania, 1780, New York, 1799.
Yeah, the argument here is that these laws were designed very carefully to avoid financial loss for the slave owners.
How so? What was the mechanism?
Well, the key was the timing. Slaves born before the date the law passed remained enslaved for life. But those born after, they were set to be freed, but only when they reached adulthood, usually 21.
Ah, so the owners had years.
Decades, potentially. Nearly 2 decades to sell those young, valuable slaves south before they hit the age of emancipation.
So the masters could recoup their investment, essentially.
That's precisely the argument, that it points to an economic calculation preserving capital rather than an immediate, overwhelming moral imperative driving those early Northern emancipation efforts.
And the economic ties didn't just vanish when the international slave trade was officially banned in 1808, did they?
Not according to this material. They emphasize that Northern merchants, flesh peddlers as they call them, just continued to trade illegally, and often, ironically, protected by the U.S. flag.
How were they protected?
Because the U.S. government, under presidents like John Quincy Adams, who personally disliked slavery, refused to let foreign powers, like Britain, search American ships on the high seas. It created a loophole, a shield for these illegal slavers operating out of northern ports.
And this continued right up to the war.
Into the war itself, according to the sources. They cite W.E.B. Du Bois quoting the New York Journal of Commerce in January 1862.
1862.
Mid-war, stating that New York City was the largest African slave trading port in the entire world, followed by Portland, Maine, and Boston.
Seriously, in 1862.
85 slave ships based in New York, supposedly moving 30,000 to 60,000 slaves annually. The numbers are just. They're hard to fathom, but that's what the sources present. The North was deeply financially tied to the ongoing profitability of the global slave trade.
Okay, that's a profoundly different picture. But it's further complicated, the sources say, by widespread prejudice against black people in the North.
Oh, absolutely. They detail extensive anti-Negro sentiment and laws. Connecticut had laws back in 1690 curfews, needing passes to leave town.
And violence, too. I remember reading about an insurrection.
New York City, 1741. A supposed slave insurrection led to mass arrests, over 200 people. 14 black individuals were burned at the stake. This wasn't a tolerant society.
And the legal hypocrisy tied to economics again. New Jersey.
New Jersey explicitly banned importing African Americans, free or enslaved. But the law's stated reason, the sources note, was to protect white labor from competition. Not morality, but economics.
Massachusetts, too.
Massachusetts law apparently mandated public flogging for any black person staying in the state longer than 2 months. Again, the aim seems to be keeping black people out, protecting white jobs.
So the argument boils down to this. Much of the early northern push for manumission, or getting rid of slavery locally, was driven by economic self-interest protecting the white labor market, not necessarily a moral awakening.
That seems to be the core argument for that early period. The widespread popular moral outrage, the abolitionist movement as we think of it. The sources suggest that Yen only gained steam later, in the 1830s, 40s, often pushed by newer immigrants who didn't have those historical financial ties. And all of this economic tension and, frankly, hypocrisy sets the stage for the second major pillar of the argument in these sources, that the war was fundamentally about settling the question of sovereignty.
Right. Who was ultimately in charge, the federal government or the individual states? A question that apparently was never really resolved from the beginning.
Exactly. The sources make a big deal about the language used or not used in the founding document.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the first government, the Articles of Confederation, explicitly called the Union perpetual. Forever.
But that government failed.
Miserably. Every single state ended up seceding from it by 1790 to form the new government under the Constitution.
And the Constitution
Conspicuously leaves out the phrase perpetual union. The sources argue this wasn't an accident, it was deliberate.
meaning the states didn't intend to be locked in forever.
That's the assertion, that they retained the right to leave. And this wasn't some crazy Southern idea later on. It was mainstream thinking at the time. They quote Senator Henry Cabot Lodge.
From Massachusetts, a northerner.
From Massachusetts, writing in 1883, well after the war. He said basically that when the Constitution was adopted, no one saw it as permanent. Everyone viewed it as an experiment that any state could peacefully withdraw from.
That's a powerful statement from a figure like Lodge.
Really is. And the sources use it to bolster the idea that secession was seen as a legitimate constitutional option.
And they also point out that New England threatened secession way more often than the South did, right?
5 times. According to this material, over the Louisiana Purchase, they feared growing Southern power. Jefferson's embargo. The War of 1812 that led to the Hartford Convention, which seriously discussed secession,
Who else?
annexation of Texas, and even the Fugitive Slave Act. Some northern abolitionists wanted out rather than comply.
5 times, compared to the South.
The South only seriously considered it twice, the sources say, after John Brown's raid and then after Lincoln's election. The argument is that secession was historically seen as the ultimate check by any state on federal power, and the North used that threat repeatedly.
Okay, so the right to leave was debated, but the bigger constitutional fight, maybe, was about who gets to interpret the Constitution in the first place.
Exactly. The Constitution itself is silent on that. Who's the final arbiter? The federal judiciary almost immediately tried to grab that power for itself. Figures like Chief Justice John Marshall.
But there was pushback.
Immediate and strong. The Supreme Court ruled in Chisholm v. Georgia in 1793 that federal courts could override state sovereignty.
And how did the states react?
They reacted furiously. The result was the 11th Amendment overturning that decision. And the sources highlight it was ratified in just 11 months.
11 months back then, with communication being so slow.
It shows just how fiercely the states guarded their sovereignty against the federal courts early on.
Which leads us to nullification, Jefferson and Madison's idea in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. What exactly was nullification, according to these sources? How is it supposed to work?
So the sources frame it as the constitutional safety valve, the ultimate peaceful check on federal overreach, short of secession.
Okay.
Jefferson and Madison argued that since the states created the federal government through the Constitution, they, the states, retained the right to judge when the federal government went beyond its assigned powers.
And the remedy?
The remedy was for a state convention representing the sovereign will of the people of that state to declare a specific federal law unconstitutional.
And then what? Just ignore the law?
Essentially, yes. Refuse to enforce it within the state's borders. The idea was this would force a confrontation, politically. It would compel the federal government to either back down, negotiate a compromise, or go through the difficult process of getting a constitutional amendment to clarify its power.
So it was meant to avoid violence, avoid secession.
That was the theory presented here. A way to resolve deep constitutional disagreements within the system.
But Chief Justice Marshall kept pushing for federal power anyway, right? Marbury, Madison.
Right. 1803. He basically inserts the principle of judicial review, the idea that the Supreme Court gets the final say, even though it's not explicitly in the Constitution. The sources portray that whole period, really from 1790 up to 1860, as this constant simmering battle over federal power versus states' rights.
A battle ultimately settled by war, not law.
That's the tragic conclusion they draw. And the biggest pre-war flare-up of this constitutional battle was the Nullification crisis of 1832.
And the sources stress this crisis was about money, not slavery.
Absolutely. It was all about the tariff. Specifically the tariff of 1828, nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations.
Abominations. Why so bad?
It jacked up average import duties to around 47%. Some things the South needed for agriculture, like iron tools, faced rates over 50%.
Then the constitutional argument against it.
Was that tariffs were only supposed to be for raising revenue to run the government, not for protecting specific domestic industries like northern manufacturing. A 47% rate wasn't just revenue, it was protectionism.
Which hurt the South how?
Because the South exported raw goods, cotton, tobacco, and imported manufactured goods. High tariffs meant they paid more for imports, while their European customers might retaliate with tariffs on Southern exports. It felt like the federal government was picking winners and losers, using its power to enrich the North at the South's expense.
Corporate welfare, basically.
That's exactly how the sources frame it. And John C. Calhoun, who was vice president then, saw it as completely unacceptable economic exploitation and a violation of the Constitution.
So he wrote,
The South Carolina Exposition and Protest, anonymously at first, laying out the case for nullification as the constitutional remedy. He presented it, the sources say, as a moderate way to fix the problem and avoid secession.
trying to preserve the Union, but on fair terms.
That seems to be the idea, which led to that famous showdown toast in 1830. President Andrew Jackson glares at Calhoun.
God, that says.
Our Union, it must be preserved.
And Calhoun's reply, equally famous.
The Union, next to our liberty most dear, implying liberty and fairness came first.
And the sources analyze that reply pretty deeply, don't they?
They break it down. First, unity is great, but justice and liberty are more important. Second, the Union's only worthwhile if it benefits everyone fairly. And third, don't you dare try to enforce unity with guns.
So South Carolina went ahead and nullified the tariffs.
They nullified the 1828 and a slightly revised 1832 tariff. And they threatened to secede if Jackson tried to use military force.
And did he?
He threatened to, but ultimately the crisis was resolved through negotiation. Henry Clay brokered a compromise, the Tariff of 1833.
Which did what?
It gradually lowered the tariff rates back down over several years, aiming for about 20% by 1842, a much more reasonable level.
And the significance of this whole episode, according to the sources.
It's presented as crucial evidence. The South did mobilize, did threaten the Union, over an economic issue and a constitutional principle, not slavery. It showed where their deepest grievances lay decades before the war. They won that fight peacefully.
Okay, so following this line of argument, the tariff war really seems like the engine driving the conflict for decades. And since tariffs were the main source of federal money before the income tax, let's really follow that money. How did this system structurally exploit the South?
Well, the sources argue it was baked in from the start. They quote Virginia Senator William Grayson back in 1789, warning that the South exporting raw materials, importing finished goods, would inevitably become the milch cow of the Union.
The milch cow.
Meaning the source of wealth that gets drained to benefit someone else. And the sources argue that by 1860, Grayson's prediction had absolutely come true.
Okay, lay out the numbers. What was the imbalance?
By 1860, the estimates cited range from 80% to 90%. Some sources even say higher of all federal revenue came from tariffs paid disproportionately by the South due to its export-import economy.
80 to 90% of the money coming in. But where did it go?
That's the kicker. Around 80% of that federal spending went straight back out to the North. Northern public works, railroads, canals, harbor improvements, subsidies for nascent industries.
So the South pays the vast majority of the bills, but the North gets the vast majority of the benefits.
That is the absolute core of the economic exploitation argument laid out in these sources. The North's industrial development was, in effect, being subsidized by Southern agriculture via the federal tax system.
And this wasn't accidental. It was policy, the American system.
Exactly. Henry Clay's system, building on Alexander Hamilton's ideas. It was designed, the sources argue, specifically to benefit Northern manufacturers and financiers. It had three main parts.
Okay, let's break those down clearly. We know high tariffs was the first. What were the other two?
The second leg was high prices for federal land out west.
High land prices. How did that benefit the North?
By making it harder for immigrants and poorer workers to just pack up and become independent farmers in the West. It kept them concentrated in northern cities.
Providing cheap labor for northern factories.
Precisely. It ensured a large pool of low-wage workers, boosting northern industrial profits. It sounds cynical, but that's the mechanism described.
Okay, high tariffs, high land prices.
Right.
What was the third leg?
Massive federal subsidies for internal improvements. Again, think railroads, canals, ports. What the sources bluntly call corporate welfare.
And these subsidies mostly went where?
Overwhelmingly to northern projects, further enriching the manufacturing and shipping sectors that were already benefiting from the protective tariffs funded by the South. It was a closed loop, benefiting one section.
The sources quote James Spence, right, writing during the war.
Yes, in 1862. He summed up the Southern feeling, saying the original idea of a fair tariff system had morphed into corrupt political bargains between special interests to impose heavy taxation on all others for their own profit.
That perception being systematically ripped off by a corrupt federal government controlled by northern interests must have been incredibly powerful, maybe more powerful than abstract arguments about states' rights.
The sources argue it was. It hit people directly in their wallets year after year.
And they also argue this high tariff system wasn't even good for the country overall. They mentioned the Walker Tariff.
Right, the Walker Tariff of 1846. It significantly lowered rates, down to about 25% on average. A huge economic boom. International trade flourished. And ironically, total federal revenue actually increased, going from about $30 million to nearly $45 million a year.
So lower tariffs were actually better for the economy and the treasury.
That's what the evidence suggested. But the sources argue the powerful northern protectionist lobby was addicted to the guaranteed profits and political influence that high tariffs gave them, regardless of the overall economic health.
Now, despite carrying this heavy tax load, the South wasn't poor, was it? The sources make a point about Southern wealth.
Far from it. Right before the war, the South was incredibly prosperous. In 1860, 6 of the top 11 states in per capita income were Southern. Mississippi and Louisiana were among the richest places in the entire country, maybe the world.
Millionaires.
Half the millionaires in the U.S. lived along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Natchez. The sources estimate that if the South had become independent, its economy would have ranked third globally, behind only the rest of the U.S. and Great Britain.
So they weren't seceding out of desperation or poverty?
Not at all. The argument presented is they were seceding to protect their immense wealth and economic future from what they saw as permanent, hostile federal exploitation.
Okay, so the economic driver is huge in this narrative. But the sources also talk about a deep cultural divide. That the North and South had just become different peoples.
Yes, they quote that British traveler Anthony Trollope visiting in 1861. He wrote that they weren't one people anymore. They had different instincts, different appetites, different morals, and a different culture.
And how do the sources describe those differences?
They characterize Northern culture, influenced by its Puritan roots, as more hurried, work-focused, maybe more materialistic, viewing nature as something to be subdued for profit.
And Southern culture?
As more leisurely, agrarian, maybe more connected to nature through hunting and fishing, and also more influenced by non-English traditions, French, Spanish, African, making it less sort of homogenous than the North.
Religion played a role, too, a growing divide there.
A huge one, especially among the elites by the 1850s. The North saw the rise of secular humanism, transcendentalism with figures like Emerson, even atheism challenging traditional Christianity.
While the South remained
Firmly the Bible Belt, focused on Orthodox Christianity, deeply suspicious of and hostile towards Northern secular trends and the political ideas that came with them. They just weren't operating from the same moral or philosophical baseline anymore.
Which leads to a really counterintuitive point the sources make about race relations. They quote Alexis de Tocqueville.
All right. Tocqueville observed famously that race prejudice seems stronger in those states that have abolished slavery than in those where it still exists.
That seems completely backward to how we usually think about it. What's the reasoning presented in the sources?
They argue the North practiced much stricter segregation. Lincoln himself favored separating the races. Southern society, while built on the brutality of slavery, was paradoxically often more integrated in daily life.
How so?
Things like black women serving as wet nurses for white children, enslaved servants attending the same church services as their masters. It created a complex, albeit deeply unequal, social fabric.
And the sources claim this actually offended Northerners.
Some Northerners, particularly New England elites, yes, that this kind of daily integration, this cultural mixing, violated their sense of racial hierarchy and social order. They even cite a Union general after the war expressing surprise that centuries of slavery hadn't made black people hate white people, suggesting a kind of complex bond the North didn't understand or approve of. That's a very challenging perspective on the cultural dynamics.
Okay, so we have these deep constitutional and economic divides, this growing cultural chasm. But something had to ignite it, right? Turn it from cold conflict to hot war. The sources argue this came through ideological warfare, particularly abolitionist rhetoric.
Right. And they stress that genuine, widespread moral outrage against slavery in the North wasn't the starting point. It was something that grew and was actively stoked.
And the key figure they identify as stoking it is William Lloyd Garrison.
Yes, publisher of The Liberator, starting in 1831. He wasn't calling for gradual change. He demanded immediate, uncompensated emancipation.
And he was pretty radical in his language.
Extremely. He famously called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell because it protected slavery. And perhaps most inflammatory, he reacted to Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831
Where dozens of white people were killed.
by essentially cheering it on, calling it the first step of the earthquake. He seemed to welcome violent insurrection.
And the effect of this extreme rhetoric in the South, according to the sources.
Catastrophic, completely counterproductive if the goal is persuasion. Before Garrison and the rise of radical abolitionism, the sources argue, Southern thinking was actually moving, albeit slowly, towards gradual emancipation, following the examples of Jefferson, Washington.
More anti-slavery societies in the South than the North, initially.
In the early 1830s, yes, according to this material. But the fear generated by calls for immediate abolition and violent uprising, fueled by abolitionist groups flooding the South with pamphlets, sometimes hidden in things like chocolate wrappers.
That must have terrified slaveholders.
It completely reversed the trend. Southern political thought hardened incredibly quickly. By 1838, you have Calhoun declaring slavery wasn't a necessary evil anymore, but a positive good.
And the sources present this shift not as inherent Southern evil, but as a direct defensive reaction.
As a political reaction to what they perceived as Northern-sponsored terrorism and relentless verbal attacks. The abolitionist movement, in this view, unintentionally solidified pro-slavery sentiment in the South.
Okay, so the rhetoric escalates. Then came the political flashpoints, the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act.
Right. That strengthened law required Northerners, federal officials, and ordinary citizens to actively help capture and return escaped slaves.
Which abolitionists refused to do.
Bitterly opposed it, often obstructed it. It was a direct challenge to federal law, framed as a moral stand.
And then came Uncle Tom's Cabin.
1851. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. The sources emphasize just how massive its impact was. It wasn't a legal argument, it wasn't economic data, it was a story.
But incredibly effective.
More effective than almost anything else, the sources argue, in galvanizing Northern public opinion, turning slavery from a political problem into a deeply felt moral crusade for millions. It primed the North for a moral conflict.
Then the conflict moves west, bleeding Kansas.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Stephen Douglas's idea to let settlers in the territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, popular sovereignty. His goal was partly to organize the territory to get a northern route for the Transcontinental Railroad.
But it repealed the Missouri Compromise line.
It did, which had prohibited slavery north of 36 degrees 30 minutes. The South supported it to maintain Senate balance, but the sources call it a huge strategic mistake for them.
Why? What were the unintended consequences?
It outraged the North. It basically forced Northerners everywhere to confront the possibility of slavery expanding and potentially requiring them to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in new territories. One source claims the act created more abolitionists in 2 months than Garrison had in 20 years.
And it led to actual violence in Kansas.
A mini-civil war. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed in, both sides armed, both sides committing atrocities. Bleeding Kansas showed political differences were now being settled with bullets, not ballots.
And that violence spilled over into Washington, D.C. itself. The caning of Sumner, 1856.
A really shocking moment. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave this incredibly abusive speech, personally attacking Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, using really vile, sexualized language according to the descriptions.
So Butler's relative, Representative Preston Brooks,
Felt Sumner's insults were too low for a formal duel, so Brooks walked into the Senate chamber and beat Sumner senseless with a heavy cane.
the reaction must have been explosive.
Total polarization. In the North, Brooks was a villain, a thug who attacked free speech. In the South, He became an instant hero. People sent him new canes.
Why hero? For violence.
The sources argue Southerners felt they had been enduring years of vicious verbal abuse from abolitionists, constantly being called immoral monsters. Brooks's act, however brutal, felt like payback, like someone finally standing up to the insults.
So when Brooks resigned,
He was immediately and overwhelmingly re-elected by his district in South Carolina. It was seen as a popular endorsement of the violence. After that, congressmen started carrying weapons to sessions. The political system was breaking down into armed camps.
but the event that truly solidified Southern fears, the sources argue, the one that convinced even moderates that the North was committed to their destruction, was John Brown's raid.
Yes. John Brown, described here as a failed businessman, but a utterly fanatical abolitionist. He got funding from wealthy, respectable New England abolitionists, the Secret Six.
And his plan for Harper's Ferry in October 1859 wasn't just a protest, was it?
Oh no, it was explicitly designed as a terrorist attack, according to these sources. Seize the federal arsenal, grab the 100,000 weapons stored there, distribute them to enslaved people, and ignite a massive slave uprising down the Appalachian Mountains.
With the goal of,
Quote, killing and burning all the way. It was intended to be a race war.
but the raid itself failed.
Almost immediately, the local enslaved population and free blacks refused to join him. His men shot and killed Hayward Shepherd, a respected free black baggage handler who was trying to warn people.
And U.S. Marines put down the revolt.
Right.
Led by.
Colonel Robert E. Lee, actually, who happened to be on leave nearby. His aide was Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart, who apparently recognized Brown from previous encounters in Kansas.
So Brown was captured, tried, executed. But the reaction to his execution is key here.
Absolutely crucial, the sources stress. Brown handled his trial brilliantly for propaganda purposes, but it was the Northern reaction that terrified the South.
How so?
Church bells tolled for him across the North when he was hanged. Women wore black armbands. Prominent intellectuals like Emerson and Thoreau compared him to Jesus Christ. He was instantly martyrdized, hailed as St. John the Just.
And the South saw this.
As proof positive that the North, or at least the now dominant Republican Party, embraced violent extremism aimed directly at them. The fact that the Republicans soon elected John Brown's own lawyer, John Albion Andrew, as governor of Massachusetts seemed to confirm their worst fears.
And the refusal of Northern governors to extradite Brown's accomplices.
That was seen as a final betrayal of constitutional obligation. Governors in Iowa and Ohio refused to send captured raiders back to Virginia for trial. The sources say this specific failure to uphold the law was cited by South Carolina, Texas, and Mississippi as a direct cause for their secession. It convinced them there was no safety left within the Union.
So by 1860, the system feels completely broken. The trust is gone. The election that year becomes the final straw for the South, confirming their fears of permanent political minority status.
Right. The sources point to figures in the rising Republican Party, like William Seward, who are openly talking about a higher law than the Constitution. This directly threatened Southern constitutional protections, particularly regarding property rights in slaves.
And the Republican platform itself was purely sectional, wasn't it? What were its main planks, according to this material?
3 core things aimed squarely at Northern interests. 1, extremely high Caris protectionism. 2, prohibiting slavery in the Western territories, which directly contradicted the Supreme Court's recent Dred Scott decision.
And 3,
massive federal subsidies for a transcontinental railroad built along a northern route. It was an economic package designed to benefit the North and West, funded implicitly by the South.
And the political reality for the South was stark. They used to dominate.
Hugely. Southern presidents, for 49 of the 72 years before 1860, usually controlled the House speakership, dominated the Supreme Court. They had held disproportionate power for decades.
But Lincoln's election changed everything.
Completely. He won with less than 40% of the popular vote, 39.8%, and didn't carry a single Southern state. Not one.
So the South saw this as
the end. The demographic shift meant they would now be a permanent political minority, subject to the whims of a hostile Northern majority committed to policies that seemed designed to exploit them economically. They felt they had lost control of their own destiny within the Union.
There's even a quote from Marx and Engels used in the sources.
Yes, arguing the conflict was fundamentally a tariff war, driven by the Northern lust for power, and not primarily about slavery as a principle. An interesting perspective from them.
Okay, so the political shift happens. But the sources argue the absolute final tipping point, the thing that made secession seem unavoidable for economic survival, was the moral tariff.
Yes. This is presented as the smoking gun for the economic argument. It passed the House in 1860 when Southern Democrats were still there, but it got blocked in the Senate.
Because Southern senators opposed it.
Vigorously. But as soon as the first wave of Deep South states seceded after Lincoln's election, their senators left Washington.
Clearing the way.
Exactly. The remaining Senate quickly passed the moral tariff, and President Buchanan Lincoln's predecessor signed it into law on March 2, 1861, just 2 days before Lincoln took office.
And what did this tariff do? How bad was it?
It was a massive hike. Average import duties jumped immediately from below 20% under the Walker Tariff to 36%, and it was set to climb even higher, hitting 47% within 3 years.
47% for the South's export-dependent economy.
Devastating. The sources are adamant about this. The cost of imported goods they relied on would skyrocket. Worse, it risked killing their golden goose, the cotton trade with Europe.
How so?
European nations, particularly Britain, would almost certainly retaliate with their own tariffs on southern cotton, or simply shift their buying to other sources like Egypt or India, which they were already developing. The moral tariff threatened to strangle the southern economy literally overnight.
So the argument is the northern industrialists needed the South out of the way politically to get this tariff passed.
That's strongly implied. That the Deep South's secession, ironically, enabled the very economic policy they most feared. For the states still considering secession, like Virginia, the moral tariff became tangible proof that staying in the Union meant economic ruin under Northern control.
Okay, so Lincoln comes into office with this tariff now law and the Deep South already gone. What was his agenda, according to these sources?
Centralize power, maintain the high tariff, and keep the Southern milch cow inside the Union to fund Northern and Western development. That's the picture painted.
And his actions seem to support this. He refused to meet Confederate peace commissioners.
Refused. He also rejected compromises like the Crittenden Compromise, which might have kept the Upper South in by guaranteeing slavery below the old Missouri Compromise line. That compromise actually contradicted his own party's platform, but he wouldn't budge.
But the most telling thing the sources argue regarding his priorities was the Corwin Amendment.
Yes, this is crucial to their case. Lincoln openly supported the Corwin Amendment in late 1860 and early 1861.
And what did the Corwin Amendment propose?
It proposed making it constitutionally impossible for the federal government ever to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. It would have enshrined slavery in the Constitution permanently in those states.
Lincoln supported that, the man who would later issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
He did. And the sources argue this proves his primary goal was not ending slavery. It was preserving the Union and, critically, the tax revenue generated by the southern states within that Union.
They quote the abolitionist Lysander Spooner on this.
Yes, Spooner argued the war was fought by the North, not to liberate the slaves, but by a government that was still willing to keep them enslaved if it meant keeping the slaveholders in the Union. Abolition was secondary, or maybe not even on the agenda initially, compared to preserving the fiscal union.
That really challenges the noble cause narrative. So how did it get to Fort Sumter? Lincoln had a choice. Let the seceded states go peacefully or force a confrontation.
And letting them go peacefully meant economic disaster for the North, according to this view. Charleston, New Orleans, operating as free ports with a low 10% Confederate tariff. They would suck trade away from high-tariff northern ports like New York and Boston. The moral tariff would be useless.
So Lincoln needed a war, but needed the South to start it.
Needed them to fire the first shot to unite the North behind him. And the sources detail what they call deliberate deception to make that happen.
Such as?
Secretary of State Seward repeatedly lying to a Confederate intermediary, Supreme Court Justice John Campbell, promising multiple times in March 1861 that Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor would be evacuated peacefully.
But he was just stalling.
Buying time while Lincoln secretly prepared military expeditions to resupply or reinforce Sumter and other southern forts like Fort Pickens in Florida.
And the most direct evidence of Lincoln's economic motive, according to the sources, comes from that meeting with the Virginia Unionists.
Colonel John B. Baldwin. A secret meeting on April 4, 1861. Baldwin told Lincoln Virginia would stay loyal if he avoided force and respected the Constitution. Lincoln, realizing he'd misjudged the situation, reportedly became agitated.
And when Baldwin suggested just letting the Deep South go in peace,
Lincoln's reported response, according to Baldwin, was laser-focused on money. And open Charleston, etc., as ports of entry with their 10% tariff. What then would become of my tariff?
if that quote is accurate, it reframes everything. The tariff revenue was the primary concern.
That's the explosive implication presented in the sources, that the fear of losing tariff income was more pressing for Lincoln than preventing war or dealing with slavery.
So the trap was sprung.
By early April, multiple U.S. naval expeditions were heading towards southern waters. On April 8th, the Confederates in Charleston were notified that Fort Sumter would be resupplied peacefully or otherwise by force.
Leaving them no choice but to see it as an act of aggression.
Exactly. They felt maneuvered into firing first. General Beauregard gave the order, and the bombardment began on April 12th.
Even the Union commander at Sumter, Major Anderson, wasn't happy about it.
He wrote, "His heart is not in the war which I see is to be thus commenced." He felt it was being initiated unnecessarily.
And the immediate result of Sumter.
Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. That act of federal coercion was the final straw for the Upper South. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee promptly seceded and joined the Confederacy. Lincoln's gamble, the sources argue, had worked. The South fired first, unifying the North for a war to preserve the Union. Now, the sources don't stop at the causes. They also detail what they describe as significant federal overreach and wartime tyranny under Lincoln, arguing the cost of preserving the Union was immense for constitutional rights.
We're starting where? Maryland.
Right. To protect Washington, D.C., which was surrounded by Maryland, a slave state with strong Southern sympathies, Lincoln immediately suspended the writ of habeas corpus.
Which allows the government to jail people without charge.
Exactly. A fundamental civil liberty.
And the courts objected.
Chief Justice Roger Taney himself, a Marylander, issued a ruling, ex parte Merriman, stating that only Congress, not the president, could suspend habeas corpus, and declared Lincoln's order unconstitutional and void.
And Lincoln's response?
He completely ignored Taney's ruling, just asserted executive power over the judiciary. There were even reports he considered having the Chief Justice arrested.
Wow. And the scale of arrests in Maryland?
Significant, according to these sources. They list 31 state legislators, the mayor of Baltimore, the chief of police, numerous editors and civic leaders. All arrested and jailed indefinitely without trial, simply for suspected Southern sympathies or opposing the war.
And this wasn't just Maryland.
No, the sources claim this happened nationwide. They estimate at least 32,000 political prisoners were held during the war across the North. And over 300 newspapers critical of Lincoln, or the war effort, were shut down by military force. A massive suppression of dissent.
Which again raises the question the sources pose. What were the Confederate soldiers actually fighting for, if not primarily slavery, given only a small percentage owned slaves?
Right, the figure cited is only 6% to 7% of Confederate enlistees were slaveholders. The sources quote Confederate Major Robert Stiles, a Yale graduate, saying they fought for liberty, meaning self-government, independence, and against what they saw as Northern arrogance, sectional domination, and the centralization of federal power.
And this is backed up by other historians.
The sources mention historian James McPherson, known for his work on the Union side, acknowledging that his research into thousands of letters and diaries showed Confederate soldiers' most commonly cited defense of their homes, liberty, and resistance to invasion and coercion as their primary motivations.
Okay, so if the war's primary drivers, according to this material, were Union preservation and economics for the North and liberty and independence for the South, where does that leave the Emancipation Proclamation? If abolition wasn't the main goal, why issue it?
The sources argue it was, first and foremost, a strategic war measure, not initially a moral declaration. They point out Lincoln's long-held preference was actually for compensated emancipation, followed by the deportation colonization of all Black Americans outside the U.S., maybe to Africa or Latin America, ideally by 1900.
Deportation, he really advocated for that.
Repeatedly, yes.
Yeah.
So the proclamation in 1863, the sources argue, served two key military and diplomatic goals.
Which were?
First, to destabilize the Confederacy internally by encouraging slaves to flee or resist. Second, and perhaps more importantly, to prevent Great Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy and potentially intervening on its behalf. Framing the war as a fight against slavery made intervention politically impossible for European powers.
And the proclamation's famous limitation, it only freed slaves where?
Where the Union had no power to enforce it in Confederate-held territory. It explicitly did not free slaves in the loyal border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, or in parts of the Confederacy already under Union control.
So the irony was obvious even then.
Absolutely. Lincoln's own Secretary of State, William Seward, reportedly quipped, "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating folks where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we can set them free."
There was even a limerick.
A popular one cited, "Lincoln, Lincoln, wily wretch, freed the slaves he couldn't catch. It highlights the political calculation. The proclamation was a masterstroke. Politically, it ended the Confederacy's hopes for foreign allies, but its immediate moral impact was limited until the 13th Amendment actually abolished slavery everywhere.
Okay, finally, the sources paint a bleak picture of the post-war reality, particularly for the newly freed African Americans and the devastated South.
Utterly bleak. Economically, the South was ruined, lost 60% of its total wealth. Property values collapsed down to about 37% of 1860 levels, largely due to the emancipation of slave property without compensation. Meanwhile, Northern property values almost doubled during the war years, fueled by tariffs and war spending. A massive wealth transfer occurred.
And the human cost for freed people.
Horrific. They were often referred to dismissively as contrabands, a term the sources equate in dehumanizing effect to the Nazi term Untermenschen.
And placed in camps.
Yes, contraband camps. The sources argue these were effectively the first modern concentration camps. Conditions were terrible: rampant disease, malnutrition, sexual violence by guards or administrators.
The death rates were high.
Astronomical, particularly among children. One statistic cited is 30,000 black children dying in the Carolinas alone in just 6 months of 1865, mostly from smallpox and starvation. It was a humanitarian catastrophe.
And the Reconstruction system that followed often didn't help. The carpetbaggers.
Often made things worse, according to this material. Northern opportunists, the carpetbaggers, leased plantations and hired freedmen, but often cheated them ruthlessly. Wages were incredibly low, maybe $5 to $7 a month, and often stolen through fraud.
To the point where even Union officers were disgusted.
Yes, they cite one Union brigadier general, a committed abolitionist, who wrote that the new system was nothing but a system of slavery, and that the former masters, for all their faults, treated slaves with a kind of parental concern compared to the naked exploitation by some Northern managers. A damning comparison.
And the economic ruin was locked in by taxes.
Puted Reconstruction tax rates, sometimes 300% or 400% higher than pre-war levels, forced widespread land defaults across the South.
How widespread?
In Mississippi alone, 15% of all taxable land was reportedly forfeited for non-payment in 1871. And who bought it up cheap?
The carpetbaggers and Northern speculators.
Largely, yes. Transferring Southern land wealth north. Then, once the economic extraction was largely complete, the sources argue, Reconstruction was abandoned, federal troops left, and the now landless, impoverished black population was left to fend for itself under the control of resentful Southern whites. A tragic end to the story.
So bringing this deep dive to a close, the source material we've examined today presents a dramatically different and challenging perspective on the Civil War.
It really does. The core argument running through all of it is that the conflict wasn't simply about slavery, but was maybe an unavoidable collision over fundamental issues of constitutional power, sovereignty.
Over decades of what the South perceived as relentless economic exploitation through tariffs and subsidies.
And fueled by a cultural divide that had become almost unbridgeable. Two fundamentally different societies, really.
The essential claim here, summarizing the sources, is that the standard narrative, the noble cause, focused only on slavery, tends to overlook or downplay these other critical factors.
Factors like the sheer scale of the wealth transfer from South to North, the genuine constitutional crises over secession and nullification that simmered for decades, and, maybe most critically, the direct economic coercion of the moral tariffs that was hitting the South right as the final break happened.
We have to remember, as historians always caution, the victor usually gets to write the history. This perspective we've explored today challenges that victor's narrative.
It does so by foregrounding Northern financial motives, the political maneuvering used to, arguably, provoke the conflict, and the deep constitutional disagreements that drove the political class towards war long before slavery became the dominant public justification.
It certainly gives you a lot to think about, and the sources leave us with a final, quite pointed question stemming directly from that alleged Lincoln quote.
A provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over, synthesize from this material. If preserving the Union above all else was the goal, and if that Union's purpose eventually became framed as freedom for all, why then did Abraham Lincoln reportedly say he might as well shut up housekeeping at once, if he couldn't have his high tariffs, even if abandoning them meant letting the Confederate States go in peace?
Why, according to that account, was the tariff apparently more critical to maintaining the Union in his eyes than preventing the war itself? Something to consider.